Hey everyone, welcome to my second video of the day and probably my 10th attempt to make a video. This is my instructor overview video, or my instructor response video rather, for the discussion last week that you guys had on monumentality. Um, and let's see here. Well, one thing I wanted to point out was I'm realizing now that I wore the same shirt last week for my video. So I promised that I washed the shirt and wore it again. I'm not just wearing the same shirt every day, even though I could, because I don't really have to go anywhere, but that's beside the point. I do laundry sometimes. But anyway, so without further ado, here are my instructor responses to your discussion questions. So the first one, compare and contrast the monuments at Giza, the pyramids, and Stonehenge. Who built them? And how are the builders alike and different? So pretty much everybody hit on the important point that we don't think that slaves built the pyramids. That was definitely something that was floated for a long time, but now we realize that the people who built the pyramids were probably working class citizens who were treated relatively well. Um, they were fed a pretty lavish diet, and there were also, beyond workers, there were other people who were working to build the pyramids as well, like priests and record keepers and people who were skilled laborers beyond just the people who physically built the pyramids. And of course, this took several generations. It wasn't just the same people who were building it for a few years. These took a long time to build. Same thing with Stonehenge. Well, there were builders that were not slaves. They did it on their own accord, according to their own free will, as far as we know. A difference would be, though, that the people in Egypt at Giza were part of a striated society that showed more of a hierarchy than in Stonehenge, where the society is probably more egalitarian. Um, in both cases, they probably built the pyramids, or they probably built the structures because of some sort of a unity. They wanted to give back to their respective societies in some way, but I think we'll get to that a little bit later. So, number two, who was buried there? And what kinds of mortuary practices can be reconstructed from the archaeological record? We all know that the pyramids are traditionally thought of as tombs for pharaohs, and they're built specifically and commissioned by certain pharaohs. But we also know, according to the video we watched and the readings, that there were other people buried, near and around the pyramids, depending on who they were, the workers, for instance. And as far as Stonehenge goes, we don't have a good idea of who was buried specifically at Stonehenge. We know that the people there were probably buried in a ceremonial way similar to the people at the pyramids, just because we think that Stonehenge is a ceremonial burial site, much like the pyramids at Giza. But we have less of an idea of who exactly was buried, just because we don't have a written record of that location. Yeah. So, oh, and as far as their mortuary practices, we know that Egyptians, of course, mummified their dead. Mummies are super famous, probably, and we know that they did this based on their written records because they wanted to be preserved for the afterlife, because they had a really robust understanding of what it was like to be dead. And as far as Stonehenge burials go, we don't know a lot beyond the fact that they were probably buried ceremonially in a way that brought nomadic bands of people together from all over. But beyond that, we don't have a really, really clear idea. What does archaeology of mortuary monuments show us about the beliefs of ancient people? I kind of went over that a little bit already, so I'll just go over that one. What motivated people to commit labor to these monuments? Were they the same motivations for Giza and Stonehenge? And I think that most of the groups sort of hit this on the head because they were similar in a lot of ways. I think the motivations were probably similar in a few ways, but also different because the society, or the Egyptian society, was naturally different than the society of the people who built Stonehenge. But basically, most of the groups hit on the fact that the people who were building the pyramids were probably, to a degree, coerced into doing so because they were part of a society and they were members of a certain class. You didn't see the pharaohs out there necessarily building the pyramids. It was the people who were of lower class, but they also wanted to build the pyramids probably because they wanted to help contribute to their society, and they thought that they were working towards something greater, which they were in a lot of ways. They were making a massive monument that was unprecedented in the area, multiple massive monuments for their pharaoh, who was godlike in their eyes. So they were doing it for religious reasons. And Stonehenge, the people at Stonehenge were also probably doing that for religious reasons as well. But they were probably not doing it for one enigmatic individual or a handful of enigmatic individuals. It seems like there was more equality as far as who was buried at Stonehenge. Let's see here. Oh, this is a good one. Do big monuments indicate a complex society? Cities. Why or why not? And once again, you guys all kind of hit this right on the head. It doesn't necessarily have to be a complex society that builds a monument. In fact, we know that nomadic pastoralists sometimes built monuments. From week 5, we talked about Göbekli Tepe, which was a monument that was built even before agriculture was fully developed. So we know that a society doesn't necessarily have to be complex to build a monument. However, we also know that societies that are traditionally thought of as more complex tend to build more monuments. So that's kind of a catch-22. Also, this kind of raises the whole question as far as like what is complexity in a society, and that's just like a wormhole that you don't want to go down, because you could argue that any society is complex if it has certain structures. What makes this Egyptian society more complex than the society that built Stonehenge? We don't like. There's no. You could argue that they have greater infrastructure. They have more of a striated society with a hierarchy, and like these are all arguments that have been made, but there's not necessarily like a more robust religious system. Like, it's hard to say with any sort of certainty what makes a society complex. So that's something to think about as well. And then we have one more question. For whom are mortuary practices held? And I mean, different people, mostly people said that they were held for the upper class, like people who could afford to do mortuary practices, but I think that it's more widespread than that. It's not like the dead were like of lower class individuals were necessarily just like thrown out in the streets or buried in like an unmarked grave. There were mortuary practices surrounding them as well, even in striated societies like Egypt. But I kind of read this question in a different way. I wouldn't say that mortuary practices are held for the elite. I think I would say that mortuary practices are held for the living. Because without the living, number one, there wouldn't be any mortuary practices. And number two, mortuary practices are so that the living can sort of rest easier knowing that their dead have gone on to something else. So I think that they're for the living to sort of rest easier, and they're also a chance for the living to come together in a unified sort of experience. And that's something that we see at both Stonehenge and the pyramids. And that's all the questions. One more thing that I wanted to clarify. A lot of groups and individuals during this discussion said that Druids built Stonehenge, and Druids did not built Stonehenge. They sort of co-opted it for themselves later on, and for a while we kind of just assumed that they built Stonehenge. But we know for a fact that Stonehenge was starting to be built before Druids were in that area of Great Britain. And recent, as far as like the last 2 or 3 years ago, recent like DNA evidence of remains there points to the fact that the people who built Stonehenge originally were of Aegean descent, so like sort of along like the Mediterranean Sea, like Greek area, and the Stonehenge transformation sort of happened over like many generations, like thousands of years. So there wasn't just one group that built Stonehenge either, but the first people who got there and started to build it were not the Druids. And the Druids probably did like leave their own personal mark during the like 15th and 16th century when they started to put it into their lore, but like they were not the ones to originally build it. So that's something to think about going forward. And that's all I have for you for my feedback. Hopefully you enjoyed the video, and hopefully my video helps you understand the material more. Thank you, and I hope everyone has an awesome week.